Yes, you both meditate.
Asante, yes, you both meditate.
Oh, yes, Antina, Cassandra.
Oh, yes, Antina, Cassandra.
Or such a 12 more dinner is you.
Or such a 12 more dinner is you.
Why no Benya said to so penny near Quabakumasi Capo Banu?
Why no Benya said to so penny near Quabakumasi Capo Banu?
Oh, Bina said, Uncle Baby.
Oh, Bina said, Uncle Baby.
And then what tell you about the fake Cassandra?
And then what tell you about the fake Cassandra?
Say one in top of my dear. Ọ̀dọ̀ fúnra yóò tún mọ́ champion fún mi.
Ọ̀dọ̀ fúnra yóò tún mọ́ champion fún mi.
Oṣù ní kúrò yóò sùn mẹ́tìtì.
Oṣù ní kúrò yóò sùn mẹ́tìtì.
Ẹja apá ìdarí náà adé àṣẹ́gun mi.
Ẹja apá ìdarí náà adé àṣẹ́gun mi.
Ẹkú sí bí ekun bí ó tún mọ́ champion fún mi.
Ẹkú sí bí ekun bí ó tún mọ́ champion fún mi.
Ẹja kó fi ṣèyí fún pro dẹ́mi fẹ́ rí sí.
Ẹja kó fi ṣèyí fún pro dẹ́mi fẹ́ rí sí.
Àsùnjẹ́ ìhìn òsè tutù tí ẹ sọ́dún mi fẹ́ wáyé.
Àsùnjẹ́ ìhìn òsè tutù tí ẹ sọ́dún mi fẹ́ wáyé.
Ó bá sùn náà dín kábọ̀ ní àbùtẹ́ tíṣà Asante mani Ghana mẹ́nyìnà.
Ó bá sùn náà dín kábọ̀ ní àbùtẹ́ tíṣà Asante mani Ghana mẹ́nyìnà.
Ó bí yàn sẹ́ẹ̀bì àǹkó bẹ́ẹ̀bì.
Ó bí yàn sẹ́ẹ̀bì àǹkó bẹ́ẹ̀bì.
Bàbá Bakana ní Efra pro dẹ́mi fẹ́ rí sí.
Bàbá Bakana ní Efra pro dẹ́mi fẹ́ rí sí.
Ní ma dàbí bàdà kò yá dùn ẹ̀yìn.
Ní ma dàbí bàdà kò yá dùn ẹ̀yìn.
Yá dùn náà ní ẹ̀dá púpọ̀ jù tó tó tún mọ́ champion fún ẹ̀yìn.
Yá dùn náà ní ẹ̀dá púpọ̀ jù tó tún mọ́ champion fún ẹ̀yìn.
Ó tó sì ká sàmà ní ẹ̀dìdà fún ẹ̀yìn.
Ó tó sì ká sàmà ní ẹ̀dìdà fún ẹ̀yìn.
Ẹ̀já pé bọ́ àbá pọ̀dún fẹ́ wọ́.
Ẹ̀já pé bọ́ àbá pọ̀dún fẹ́ wọ́.
Òyìnbá fẹ́rẹ́ Efra pro dẹ́mi fọ́ o.
Òyìnbá fẹ́rẹ́ Efra pro dẹ́mi fọ́ o.
Ó kókó ọ̀lẹ́bí mọ́ọ̀dì ní ẹ̀rí sí o.
Ó kókó ọ̀lẹ́bí mọ́ọ̀dì ní ẹ̀rí sí o.
Wọ́n ń lo bẹ́ẹ̀ nyẹ́sẹ̀ já tí òpó kúpẹ́ ní ẹ̀chẹ́ ìpá àbánu ọ.
Wọ́n ń lo bẹ́ẹ̀ nyẹ́sẹ̀ já tí òpó kúpẹ́ ní ẹ̀chẹ́ ìpá àbánu ọ.
Ó bí yàn sẹ́ẹ̀bì àǹkó bẹ́ẹ̀bì.
Ó bí yàn sẹ́ẹ̀bì àǹkó bẹ́ẹ̀bì.
Àsí ní ẹ̀jẹ̀ bíbọ̀ yín ní ìtumọ̀ champion fún ẹ̀yìn.
Àsí ní ẹ̀jẹ̀ bíbọ̀ yín ní ìtumọ̀ champion fún ẹ̀yìn.
Wọ́n ní mẹ́ẹ̀chẹ́ ìpá bó sùmẹ́dìtì.
Wọ́n ní mẹ́ẹ̀chẹ́ ìpá bó sùmẹ́dìtì.
Ó bí ẹ̀jẹ̀ pàṣípẹ́ fún ẹ̀yìn.
Ó bí ẹ̀jẹ̀ pàṣípẹ́ fún ẹ̀yìn.
Ẹ̀kúsìkè fún bó tún mọ́ champion fún ẹ̀yìn.
Ẹ̀kúsìkè fún bó tún mọ́ champion fún ẹ̀yìn.
Mo bẹ kẹsì náà dé tìrasì ẹ̀yìn.
Mo bẹ kẹsì náà dé tìrasì ẹ̀yìn.
Ó sọ tàbí ẹ̀dẹ̀mẹ̀ fẹ́ kásá ẹ̀yìn.
Ó sọ tàbí ẹ̀dẹ̀mẹ̀ fẹ́ kásá ẹ̀yìn.
Jẹ́ǹpẹ̀ fíàfù ó sọ ní tún bó tún mọ́ champion fún ẹ̀yìn.
Jẹ́ǹpẹ̀ fíàfù ó sọ ní tún bó tún mọ́ champion fún ẹ̀yìn.
Ọdún fún fọlẹ́ mẹ́ńpẹ́ mọ́ sísá fọlẹ́ mẹ́ńpẹ́ fún ẹ̀yìn.
Wọ́n mú fọlẹ́ mẹ́ńpẹ́ mọ́ sísá fọlẹ́ mẹ́ńpẹ́ fún ẹ̀yìn.
Ọ̀sáfọ́dù ṣẹ̀ṣẹ̀ mọ́ kúmẹ́jẹ́ bó tún mọ́ champion fún ẹ̀yìn.
Ọ̀sáfọ́dù ṣẹ̀ṣẹ̀ mọ́ kúmẹ́jẹ́ bó tún mọ́ champion fún ẹ̀yìn.
Ọ̀sáfọ́bọ̀sù ọ̀bọ̀ sùmẹ́tìtì.
Ọ̀sáfọ́bọ̀sù ọ̀bọ̀ sùmẹ́tìtì.
Ọ̀sáfọ́nẹ̀ẹ́dẹ́ kàsányẹ̀yìn.
Ọ̀sáfọ́nẹ̀ẹ́dẹ́ kàsányẹ̀yìn.
Ẹ̀rù adó òpèdè pèpè kú di fata bọ̀fọ́ sẹ́ńtúrà fata rìbìngẹ̀yìn.
Ẹ̀rù adó òpèdè pèpè kú di fata bọ̀fọ́ sẹ́ńtúrà fata rìbìngẹ̀yìn.
Òkúrú bẹ́ẹ̀ tó pé bó tún mọ́ champion fún ẹ̀yìn.
Òkúrú bẹ́ẹ̀ tó pé bó tún mọ́ champion fún ẹ̀yìn.
Wọ́n sáájú fóògùn yẹn gbà sí ẹ̀yìn.
Wọ́n sáájú fóògùn yẹn gbà sí ẹ̀yìn.
Òkú Asante kàsányẹ̀yìn.
Òkú Asante kàsányẹ̀yìn.
Wọ́n kúrú bẹ́ẹ̀ tó pé bá dẹ̀mẹ̀ fún yẹn gbà sí
Jump.
Come here.
Jump.
You followed what they were saying.
Jump.
Because when you were doing the introduction, I realized that you were on top of what is happening in Kumasi. And
Jump.
you know. It is barely 8 weeks since I welcomed to our palace in Kumasi the directors of the British Museum and the Victoria and Albert Museum,
Jump.
who had traveled down to formally hand over a cache of traditional artifacts the museums had loaned to our Manshia Museum.
Jump.
The artifacts, as the world knows, were part of a huge stock looted from the palace of my great-granduncle during the invasion of Kumasi by the British troops in 1874.
Jump.
And their return was the culmination of years of careful negotiations between us and the two great museums.
Jump.
The return of the artifacts had been timed to commemorate the silver jubilee of our reign as the 16th occupant of the Golden Stool.
Jump.
It was an important objective for us, given the growing bonds of friendship between our peoples, to find a pathway through the logjam in the global conversation about the restitution of cultural artifacts extracted from various centers in wholly unethical circumstances during the epoch of global colonial enterprise, and to demonstrate that with sincerity, mutual trust, and goodwill, the world can overcome any impediments to the rational resolution of all conflicting goals.
Jump.
The response of my people to the return of these artifacts has been truly reassuring. The return is being celebrated at one level with the same reverence as the heroes of the state returning from enforced exile and at another level, as marking the spiritual reconnection with lost souls.
Jump.
Critically for me, it has spread among the young not just a new model of self-belief and confidence in their heritage, but an inspiration to strive to add to that heritage of excellence in creativity and innovation.
Jump.
There could not be a more appropriate moment for this than the period when the minds were focused on celebrating the important landmark in our advancing history.
Jump.
The response of our people has added to our great pleasure in accepting the joint invitation of the British Museum and the Victoria and Albert Museum to deliver the memorial lecture on Asante heritage, past and present.
Jump.
It is a pleasure to see among today's distinguished audience some of the eminent historians and anthropologists, like my very good friend, Professor Malcolm MacLeod, who had labored hard to tell the Asante story to the world. He joins a long line of brilliant scholars and ethnographers from R.S. Rattree, Ivor Wells, Thomas McCaskey, for whom we can only express our deepest appreciation for the sincerity of their endeavor in capturing the essence of our heritage to a skeptical world.
Jump.
But our debt to MacLeod is even greater for his readiness to join my grandson Ivor Agyemangua to negotiate with the museums on behalf of the Menchia Museum for the return of the artifacts.
Jump.
But even as we acknowledge the seminal works of these historians and their Ghanaian colleagues, such as Albert Adubuahin, J.H. Kwabranketia, Alex Ataya Ochematin, William Tordolf, and Kwame Ahin, one has to concede to the relative paucity of literature in our heritage.
Jump.
This is a surprising deficit considering the encyclopedic range of Asante folklore, the culture of storytelling around the fireside, and the monumental compendium of proverbs with which our heritage is enriched.
Jump.
Chinua Achebe reminds us that in much of African culture, proverbs are the palm oil with which words are eaten.
Jump.
To the unlettered in West African culinary arts, this is one of the favorite edible vegetables, almost sacred.
Jump.
Or to quote an authority closer to some of you, Francis Bacon proclaims that the genuines, wit, and spirit of a nation are discovered by their proverbs.
Jump.
At the risk of appearing to over-egg the pudding, one could find in the Anansi stories a mini Shakespearean experience in wit and wisdom and complexity in storytelling. And yet, we have only the example of the mother of our chairman today, Peggy Cripps Appiah, who has endeavored to add the inimitable Anansi to the literature of our times.
Jump.
Equally, one sees little of the proverb distilled from the pot of wisdom of our forefathers.
Jump.
This literature deficit notwithstanding, Asante heritage, which we inherit with pride, is a tapestry of golden formulations embracing a system of governance consecrated through the fairness of time, loyalty to our traditions, respect for laws, and an unfailing fidelity to the values that define us. In the tradition of Asante, there is no disconnect between the past and the present. The present is continuous from the past as the future is shaped by the present. And so we walk with unfailing respect for the past, confidence in the present, and ebullience in the future.
Jump.
To fully appreciate the essence of this heritage, we need to step back in time to the foundations of our state. The Asante state was a creative response to the imperative of warfare in a particularly dangerous period in history. The coming together of smaller states sharing a common language to forge a union capable of defending their independence and advancing their well-being was an act of immeasurable creativity and statecraft.
Jump.
If, as we are told in history, the specifics of place and period are critical, then we should not forget that my great-great-grand-uncle Opemsuo and his advisor, Otumfuo, were creating deep in the forest zone of West Africa a union of states of real consequence during the same epoch when the Federalists and Confederates were struggling to create the Federal Union, which is the United States of America.
Jump.
The convergence of these objectives within the same epoch in time, I would suggest, deserves historical acknowledgement.
Jump.
The power of the alphabet, which is writing and reading, had not yet penetrated the forest zone, and none of the chiefs gathered together had received any form of external education which would have influenced their thinking. It therefore speaks to their innate wisdom and creativity in embarking upon this exercise in nation building, and yet the union state they created, with a monarch at the apex of and the golden stool as the unifying emblem, has endured through all the changing times to this day in our own reign. It has been adaptable to the political evolution of our time without losing its essence.
Jump!
Understandably, our initial encounters with Britain were far from friendly. We were a fiercely confident African nation determined to preserve its independence, with the freedom to trade with whosoever was willing to trade with us. Our ambitions were obviously at odds with the imperial interests of the colonial enterprise, and the clash of interests inevitably smeared our early encounters in blood through 5 debilitating wars in which both sides lost several thousand lives.
Jump!
In the end, the realism of power determined the direction of history, and proud Asante became another number in the bargain list of colonial conquests.
Jump!
But even after the far from happy beginnings, British sense of realism recognized the merit in the preservation of the structures of the Union State as conceived by our founding fathers. So through the years of colonial rule, through the storms of pre-independence struggle to the revolutionary challenges of recent history, the institution, the Asante State, as structured by our forefathers, has remained as resilient as ever.
Jump!
Thankfully, it is not only the people of Asante who are the devotees of chieftaincy. They probably may be the greater believers, but there is no part of Ghana where chiefs, as traditional leaders, do not have a sway.
Jump!
As a result, the people of Ghana have fashioned a constitution which has wisely bolted the institution of chieftaincy onto the institutions of the modern democratic state. So we are able to serve the national interests as a steadying hand in troubled circumstances,
Jump!
a glue for national cohesion, and a dependable channel for conflict resolution and the preservation of peace.
Jump!
Central to the enduring system has been the unbroken confidence of the people of Asante in their monarch and in the chiefs constituting the traditional state.
Jump!
In Asante etymology, Tete, the past, is a loaded invocation from ancient history and a nod to our beings, our very founding. Our folklore tapestry has hundreds of proverbs associated with it. 2 of them, Tete Wobika, the past has something to say, and Tete Wobitre, the past has something to teach us across historical times in our cardinal sociology of memory.
Jump!
This respect for our past provides the unbroken thread that keeps the Asante state together. When a chief goes to his village, as we traditionally describe his final journey in life, a stool is consecrated to memorize his reign. He becomes a continuous spiritual presence in the affairs of the state, and successors are required to swear an oath to continue with his good deeds.
Jump!
Without the benefit of the alphabet, during the epoch of the birth of the Asante Union, the soul of the nation, our moral and spiritual values, the ethos of our being, all found expression not in literature, but in our artistic creations, in folklore, in music, and in our irresistible kente cloth. Our chiefs were adorned in them as expression of their leadership, but the artisans were the conveyors of the philosophical underpinnings of our blossoming state.
Jump!
What this tells us is that, for us, the artifacts we speak about are not just some inanimate creations of our aesthetic value. They represent our soul. They represent the spirit of our ancestors, the authority of our kings, and the heroes of our past returning in triumph from the battlefield.
Jump!
The evidence of that past in terms of visualization and craftsmanship, whether of religious or interior palace decoration, would be the 1874 and 1896 royal regalia and objects which were looted. Of the 1874 loot, the dazzling ornaments of gold, silver, and brass, described as crown jewels, were sold in the open act and auction houses, first in Cape Coast in the Gold Coast before the journey to England within the first quarter of 1874.
Jump.
We are aware that, for example, the famous collector and scientist, Sir Henry Wellcome, purchased some of these objects and others in Africa and South Asia, enabling him to create a legacy of cultural patrimony that will form part of the British colonial narrative.
Jump.
Of course, artistic creations, folklore, music, and dance are by no means the totality of our heritage. We have noted the heritage of nation building and the system of governance created 400 years ago that has endured to this day. Within the embryo, we see a heritage of valor in battle, loyalty in service, rugged individual enterprise, and feisty diplomatic acumen attuned to the pursuit and preservation of peace.
Jump.
A cursory glance at history will tell us that the first century of military valor saw the expansion of Asante into an empire with influence across much of the territory of Ghana. Asante had become an independent entity with prosperous trading ties that not only with its neighbors but with Europe and the Mediterranean and Moorish cultures.
Jump.
Asante not only had lucrative trading ties with the Portuguese, the Danes, and the Dutch, but in fact enjoyed diplomatic ties.
Jump.
In the 19th century, Asante found itself confronting British interests which had taken over colonial outposts of the coastal belt of the Gold Coast from their previous European colonialists.
Jump.
The 1874 invasion of Kumasi, the capital of our flourishing kingdom, by the British military forces, and the subsequent burning of his stone palace, the Aban, which also served as his royal residence from the reign of Asante Opemsuo, was to have serious ramifications for both our heritage and historic ties with Britain.
Jump.
The thousands of lives lost, the burning of Kumasi by retreating British forces, the destruction of the palace of Asante and the looting of its contents might well have left wounds that would normally be difficult to heal. The fact that we have overcome the pains of the past speaks to the profound value system compressed into the chalice of our heritage, a mix of steadfastness in defense of our independence and realism and wisdom in the pursuit of peace.
Jump.
The heritage of valor in battle has obscured the fundamental belief of our forefathers, which has guided me through our reign, that the courage to wage wars must be matched at all times by the wisdom to make peace. This belief was made manifest several times in our history. There was the ancient gold in us, which is part of the royal collection at Windsor, that was given as a gift to Queen Victoria in 1882.
Jump.
My great-grand-uncle, Nana Mensibosu. British diplomats at the time were aghast. They saw the gift of an axe almost as a declaration of war because the axe is deemed a weapon of violence or destruction. But what was the motivation behind the gift? It was a diplomatic symbol of negotiation intended to convey to the Empress that in Asante, an axe was used to cut through difficult things, including misunderstandings or disputes, and to reassure her of Asante's readiness to sit down together to cut through any misunderstandings or to achieve peace.
Jump.
This was 8 years after the 1874 invasion and the war that followed, in which Asante lost over 4,000 soldiers with heavy casualties on the British side as well. Most likely, much of what was to follow between us may have been avoided if the message of the golden axe had been grasped. It was quite refreshing, though, that 100 years after that misunderstanding, Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth gave permission for this object to be borrowed for the Asante Kingdom of Gold exhibition at the same museum.
Jump.
Later in 1896, my grand-uncle Ajman Prempe I opted to sacrifice his own freedom to avoid another war. Prempe was facing realism. Asante was tired of wars and unprepared for another one, least of all with one against a power like the British. He was not going to risk the lives of his gallant forces around him. The consequence was his exile from his people for 3 years within the coast of the Gold Coast, then to Freetown, and finally to the island of Seychelles, where he was held for 25 years.
Jump.
When King Prempe was finally allowed to return to his people, his mission was to heal the wounds and bury the horrors of the past. Asante and Britain bound together, and realism demands that we forge a future of peace and harmony together.
Jump.
Asante had been integrated into the Gold Coast, now the Republic of Ghana. And the new reality, that message and that commitment was critical for the maintenance of cohesion and orderly progress. It has remained critical through the evolution of our new policy and has become the bedrock on which our relationship have been shaped.
Jump.
It is important to acknowledge the extraordinary vision and sacred of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth in the process of creating a propitious environment for healing the past and constructing a new structure based on trust and mutual respect. Britain's second Elizabethan era changed the dynamics of post-imperial Britain's relations, and I'm proud to see it continue and to flourish. It has been our honor and pride to raise upon these foundations as a superstructure of enduring friendship and this mutual interest of our people.
Jump.
Needless to say, it is in this spirit that we have entered into the agreement that have allowed us to receive some of our artifacts back. As we have alluded to, it has not been an instant deal. Believe it or not, it has stretched well over 50 years. The demand for the restitution of the looted artifacts was first made by Prempeh I when he returned from Seychelles in 1924. In 1946, my uncle Ajman Prempeh II made similar appeals and entered into some levels of negotiations, all of which fell apart. At that time, the Gold Coast was agog with anti-colonial fervor, and even though he had been given a knighthood in recognition of his leadership, there was no progress on his quest to have the items back in Kumasi.
Jump.
I presume the colonial authorities had more pressing issues on their hands than the fate of what may have been perceived as some inconsequential tribal objects.
Jump.
My brother Otumfuo, who succeeded our uncle Sajman Prempeh II, continued with this quest and even held a major exhibition in collaboration with the British Museum in 1982,
Jump.
Asante Kingdom of Gold, which was jointly opened by him and the Duke of Gloucester. He traveled to the American Museum of Natural History in New York the same year. That formal cooperation with this museum, as the inherited correspondences show, has been on for 50 years, and the ultimate issue of the return of objects had danced around some other forms of cultural cooperation until recently.
Jump.
I took up the matter shortly after ascending to the Golden Stool and was encouraged by the fact that the restitution of cultural objects had become an issue of global concern with legitimate claims from several countries. The UNESCO had made it a priority. It is no longer disputed that many cultural objects were either looted or extracted from Africa and other colonial zones illegally. But even while acknowledging this, nations point to a litany of legal and historical barriers to ready restitution. I recognize the depth of feeling, the legitimate emotion generated by this issue. In a world already wobbling in a myriad of political miscalculations, we cannot afford to allow this to fester beyond control.
Jump.
We chose the path of silent diplomacy, believing that with trust and sincerity of purpose, we could navigate the maze and find a way that brings us to the point of mutual satisfaction. When we seriously engaged with the two museums, I set my team a target to make sure my people would see their stolen ornaments back in Kumasi for the silver jubilee of our reign.
Jump.
I'm proud we achieved this, and a number of our prized ornaments are now resting within the palace from where they were forcibly extracted.
Jump.
Even so, we do not and cannot pretend that the agreement we have offers a solution to the issue of restitution. What it does is to acknowledge the impediments in the path, not in order to submit to it, but to find avenues for fruitful engagement while continuing to seek the appropriate rational resolution.
Jump.
In days gone by, our nations needed brave hearts to win wars. Today, we need great minds to win souls.
Jump.
Our brave warriors knew how to navigate through the dense forest to engage and overcome enemies. We now need our great minds to navigate the dense fog of problems to win friends.
Jump.
That is the new Asante reality. It remains our unalterable position that articles of cultural importance looted or procured in unethical circumstances through the colonial enterprise must be restored to their origins. This is the position of UNESCO and the position clearly endorsed by the government of France. We are mindful of some residual resistance, but in the main, we will contend that all of us in this room are victims of a system in need of updating. We are either victims of a system that denies us justice or victims of a system that prevents us from administering justice and doing what we know to be the right thing. From both sides, we need with sincerity to appeal to our conscience. Nobody disputes the fact that much of the cultural objects at issue were obtained in illegal or unethical circumstances. Can anyone in good conscience sustain the enactment of a law to protect illegality? That has to be a monumental challenge to jurisprudence, and I dare say a challenge to what I unshakably believe to the British justice. My sincere hope is that in the fullness of time, sooner than later, state authorities will take steps to review laws contrived to protect illegalities and permit all concerned to apply themselves to the rational resolution of the challenge of restitution. I stand ready in the spirit of international harmony to invite the world to Kumasi for a global conference to seek universal consensus on the peaceful and rational restitution of illegally procured cultural objects. It is a fact that we had to replace the looted ornaments to be able to continue with the spiritual and traditional rites they were created for. The new ones were made by the Otumfuo, the royal artisans who continued their artistic obligations in the 1900s. The Janchemche ceremonial cap, which was made centuries ago, of antelope hide with gold ornaments, and then Opemsuo sword of lost was cast in gold, which was taken from the Kumasi Palace in 1895-96, have been with the British Museum for over a century and a half until recently. But even with their replacements that have allowed us to continue with their spiritual and varied roles, the return of the original objects had to be celebrated as a liberation of the soul from captivity. I have alluded to the heritage of individual enterprise in Asante history. It is not always appreciated, even by our historians, that the driving force behind the expansion of Asante Empire was trade. Asante was a major hub for gold trade, whose route extended from the forest to the Sahel. Through trade, we made contact with Islam, which had its own converse. When Asante was eventually integrated into the Gold Coast, a sizable crop of men of immense entrepreneurial acumen was on hand to set off a burst of private enterprise. They became the dominant force in cocoa production, which was to become the mainstay of the economy of the Gold Coast. That culture of enterprise has not receded. It is the beacon of private enterprise and the driving force in Ghana's economic development. Along with the heritage of individual enterprise, Asantes have added a culture of traveling, which has seen them spread in all corners of the planet. Indeed, nothing can give one greater pleasure than to see one's grandchildren in such eminent circumstances as our own Kwame Anthony Appiah, Bernard Mensah, or Ofiechei, the daughter of one of my lawyer chief, now celebrated as the Deputy Governor of the Bank of Ghana. Of course, the outstanding men and women of our heritage who are serving Britain and many other countries in key positions in government as ministers and members of parliament. All these great minds in the diaspora are like a sprinkling of gold dust on the tapestry of Asante heritage. We cherish them and hope the thread never breaks. Between the bubbling captains of private enterprise at home and the flourishing resources in the diaspora, I see a rewarding convergence and the potential for successful collaboration that could inject fresh momentum into the economy of Ghana. In the meantime, I will urge the continued pursuit of collaboration with the museums and advanced cultural institutions, renewed attention to training in the creative arts, and a vigorous effort to expand market opportunities for works of African artists. The quest for restitution should be no reason for closing the market to our artists. On the contrary, it should point to the searchlight on the value of African art to museums and collectors for legitimate acquisition. African artists, need to be appreciated. They have to be seen to be appreciated. And like all other artists, they can only be seen through museums and galleries. Opening the market to them and expanding the range of opportunities to them should be part of the global conversation. The African genius, the Nigerian Nobel Right in Literature, Wole Soyinka, writing under the arts in Africa during the period of colonial rule, says, was hardly a match for the factory, whose products began to flood African markets even at the early stages of colonial venture. He was worried of the loss of integrative role of art in normal community development, especially of the Kodo of the Asante, whose decorative motifs were as much the case in Africa, symbols of traditional lessons, proverbs, moral counsels, and episodes in history. Heritage, including of Soyinka's writing on the Kodo, almost 40 years ago, could get out of fashion and suffer nostalgia, but regenerates itself with patrons going back to the original or authentic make, as they have done at Sokoban for centuries, where these brass treasures are manufactured for the public and to replenish the palace collection that are inherited. These days, unlike in the past, clients go with their own designs, whether to the Edinkra symbols or from other societies in West Africa and beyond. Thus, heritage, in whatever form, could be reinterpreted and reinvented. Long may the regeneration of cultures adapt. Long may the regeneration of cultures adapt well to the modern engineering society. It is one nation with many histories, as one historian aptly puts it. And so, we will conclude this lecture in the context of this beginning. There was the happily shared news which was most manifested when the global media channels announced the return of the objects to Kumasi. Many Ghanaians of different ethnic groups, including those who abhorred the terminology loan, were upbeat. They saw its tangibility as all belonging and also as an intangible aspect of the histories we share. Commentators in other parts of the continent claimed it as well, using ours instead of theirs, in what was seen as a form of heritage recovery, an adjustment of the small scale of empire narrative. When cultural cooperation endures, humanity is better off. Thank you very much.